Kansas Territory, June 1873, the wind howled low across the tallgrass prairie, bending it like a prayer whispered too long. The sun was sinking fast behind the horizon when Everett Sloane dropped to her knees in the middle of the open land, clutching her swollen belly with both hands. She was alone. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. Her canteen had gone dry before noon. And the wagon that had broken down 3 days ago carrying her and everything she had left in the world now sat miles behind her, a cracked axle rendering it useless. She had walked until her boots split at the seams. Her dress clung to her legs with sweat and dust. Now, with her baby due any day, she had nothing left to give. Everett had not cried in years. But now the tears came hot and fast, smearing dirt across her cheeks. "Please," she whispered to nothing. "Please, just let it end." She did not even hear the horse at first, just the shift of hooves in dry grass. Then the low voice, "Ma'am." She turned her head and blinked up at the silhouette of a man on horseback, framed by the last light of day. His hat was pulled low, but his voice was kind. "Deep, steady, you all right?" he asked, dismounting without waiting for her answer. She shook her head. "No," she rasped. "I think I am dying." He knelt beside her. His hands hovered, unsure where to touch. He was young, maybe 25, maybe a little older, sun-browned, lean, with a rifle slung across his back and a bandana tied around his neck. "You hurtin'?" he asked. "No, I am just tired." Her voice broke. "I cannot keep going." He saw the curve of her belly, the way her hands protectively cradled it. "How far along?" "Too far." She gave a half laugh, bitter. "I was supposed to be in Salina by now, a boarding house, a midwife, but the axle snapped and I could not fix it. I have not seen another soul in 2 days." He looked around, then back at her. "There is a creek not far from here. Come on, we will get you water, get you out of this sun." "I cannot walk." He nodded once. "Then I will carry you." She tried to protest, but he was already scooping her into his arms. She was light, too light for a woman due any day now. She did not flinch when he lifted her, just went limp against his chest, her head falling to his shoulder. "What is your name?" she asked, voice muffled against his shirt. "Cassian Keller," he said. "Friends call me Cass." "Everett," she whispered. "Everett Sloane." He adjusted her gently in his arms. "Well, Miss Everett Sloane, you picked a hell of a stretch of land to lie down on." "I did not pick it. It just happened." Cass carried her to his horse, a calm bay mare that stood steady as he lifted Everett into the saddle. He climbed up behind her, one arm firm around her waist, guiding the horse toward a line of cottonwoods in the distance. By the time they reached the creek, the sun had slipped below the horizon. He helped her down, led her to the water, and gave her slow sips from his flask. "You got anyone waiting on you?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, my husband died last winter, fever in Missouri." He said nothing, just handed her his coat and started a fire. They camped there that night under a sky scattered with stars. Everett sat with her knees pulled close, one hand resting on her belly, the other holding a tin cup of warm broth Cass had made from what he had on his packhorse. He had a bedroll, but gave it to her without hesitation, sleeping on his saddle blanket instead. She watched him as he settled beside the fire. His face was quiet, thoughtful, not the sort of man who filled silence with talk. She liked that. "You are not afraid?" she asked suddenly. He looked over. "Of what?" "Of being alone out here," he shrugged. "Been alone most of my life." "But not tonight." Their eyes met across the firelight. Everett looked away first, but not before something warm flickered in her chest, something dangerous. Hope. The next morning he helped her sit up, fed her bread and dried apples, and checked her feet, blistered from walking. "I am taking you to Salina," he said. "You do not have to, I do." They rode again, slow but steady. She leaned back against him, her body so tired it barely held shape. He kept one arm around her the whole time, steadying her, protecting her. They reached a small trading post by late afternoon. Cass bought more supplies, traded a few pelts for a proper blanket and soft shoes for Everett. He fussed without saying much, always checking she had enough water, helping her eat, making sure she rested. That night she asked, "Why are you doing this for me?" He paused, then said softly, "Because I could not ride past and leave you there." She studied him in the firelight again. "You are kind," she said. Cass looked down. I am just doing what is right. No, she said, kindness is not common. Not anymore? He did not answer, but his hand brushed hers when he passed her the cup, lingering just a little longer than needed. The next day, the pain started. It came in sharp waves, low in her back, wrapping around her like a belt. She doubled over in the saddle, and Cass felt her stiffen. You all right? No, it is happening. He pulled the horse to a stop. Now she nodded, teeth clenched. He scanned the land, then spotted an old sod house tucked into a hillside not far from the trail. It looked abandoned but solid. Shelter. He carried her there, set her down on a pile of hay, and laid out everything he had, clean water, cloth, his coat folded for a pillow. You ever delivered a baby before? She gasped. No, he said, but I will not leave you. Hours passed. She screamed once, then bit down hard on her sleeve to keep from doing it again. Cass stayed beside her, wiping her brow, whispering steady words. You are doing good, just keep going. You are not alone. It was just before dawn when the baby came a boy, slippery and red-faced, yelling his way into the world. Everett held him to her chest, sobbing with relief. Cass sat back, arms shaking, face pale. Well, he said hoarsely, you did it. She looked up at him. We did. He gave her a small, stunned smile. She named the baby Bishop. 2 days later, Everett stood outside the sod house, baby in her arms, wrapped in Cass's coat. He stood beside her, watching the prairie stretch out in every direction. I do not want to go to Selena anymore, she said. He looked at her. Where do you want to go? She turned to him. Wherever you are going. Cass reached for her hand, rough fingers curling around hers. You sure? I have not been sure of much lately, she said. But I know you are the only thing that has felt right in a long time. He stepped closer, cupping her cheek gently. You are stronger than anyone I have ever met. So are you, she whispered, and when he kissed her, it was soft, certain, and full of something new, something real. Everett leaned into him, baby Bishop asleep between them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed in tomorrow. They would ride on together, not just surviving, but living. And loving. The wind shifted warmer as summer pressed deeper into Kansas. Days grew longer, the air thick with scent earth after rain, wild sage crushed beneath hooves. Cass had found a cabin 2 miles from a river fork, half sheltered by cottonwoods. It had stood empty long enough for the roof to sag, but the walls were sound, the hearth strong. He cleared the space while Everett rested, Bishop swaddled against her chest, his breath soft and steady. They stayed. Not because they had to, but because nothing pulled them elsewhere. Cass repaired the roof with pine shakes he'd traded for at a Mennonite farmstead 3 ridges south. He patched the door with wagon boards and hung new hinges. Everett cleaned slowly, gently in the hours when Bishop slept. She moved with care, her body still healing, but her hands were firm, capable. She found a rhythm in the small things, scrubbing soot from the stone hearth, folding linens Cass brought back from town, cooking with the little they had. One evening, as dusk folded across the land, Cass returned from the river with a string of perch and a rabbit hanging from his saddle. Everett met him at the gate, Bishop slung in a cloth wrap across her chest, his tiny head tucked beneath her collarbone. You catch all that today? She asked, nodding toward the game. He handed her the rabbit. Would have had another, but something spooked the brush. Might have been a fox. She took it without hesitation, turned toward the bench beside the door. I'll skin it before the light goes. Cass loosened his saddle cinch. You sure you're up for it? Everett didn't look up. I'm not glass, Cassian. He watched her work for a moment, then stepped close enough to say, Didn't say you were, just not used to someone taking care of me while I'm trying to take care of them. She paused, knife poised. You think that's what I'm doing? He crouched beside her. I think you're stronger than most men I've known. Everett's hands stilled. The breeze shifted her hair across her cheek, and she pushed it back with the back of her wrist. Is that supposed to impress me? She asked, not sharp but testing. No, he said. Supposed to be honest. She resumed her work, stripping the pelt clean with practiced speed. I haven't impressed anyone in a long while. You impressed me the day you didn't quit, he said. She stopped again, slower this time. I nearly did, but you didn't. And now you're here. Everett looked up. Where is here exactly? He glanced at the hills, the trees, the smoke rising from their chimney, someplace that could become home. That night after supper, Everett rocked Bishop in the chair Cass had built from scrap wood and bent nails. He'd shaped it by hand, sanding it smooth with riverstone and wrapping old shirt cloth around the seat. She hadn't said anything when he first brought it inside, just ran her fingers along the armrest, then sat without a word, Bishop curled in her lap. Now, as firelight flickered against the log walls, Cass cleaned the rifle across his knees, glancing over every so often. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just checked the chamber, then set the rifle down. "I used to think I'd never stop moving. That if I stayed put, things would catch up to me." She shifted Bishop gently, brushing his hair back. "What things?" He leaned forward. "My father left when I was 6. My mother tried to hold onto our land, but it all dried up. We starved half that winter. After she passed, I drifted. Never could hold onto anything long enough to lose it again." Everett didn't speak, but her eyes found his in the quiet. "I don't want to drift anymore," he said. She nodded slowly. "Then don't." The next morning, Cass hitched the mare to a cart he'd built from wagon remnants and rode into Salina. He returned with flour, beans, a tin of coffee, and a pair of leather boots just small enough for Everett's feet. She didn't ask how he paid for them. She just slid them on and walked out into the yard, Bishop bundled on her hip. "You traded your saddle for these," she said, not a question. Cass leaned against the fence rail. "A man can ride bareback if the ground's worth staying on." She stepped closer, looking up at him. "You shouldn't do things like that. I'll stop when you stop mattering." Everett stood still for a long moment, the air thick with something neither of them tried to name. Then she reached for the collar of his shirt and pulled him down, brushing her mouth against his. It wasn't hurried or unsure, it was quiet, like a truth spoken aloud for the first time. When they pulled apart, Bishop stirred, his tiny fists stretching against her chest. Cass smiled, just slightly. "He's got your look." Everett glanced down. "He's going to need more than that. He'll have both of us," Cass said. "Whatever comes next." She rested her head against his shoulder. "Then I think we're going to be all right." They stood there until the light changed and the prairie turned gold around them. Nothing rushed, nothing needed to. They had time now, and they had each other. By late August, the tall grass brushed Everett's waist as she walked the fence-line with Bishop pressed against her chest, his soft weight bound snug in a sling Cass had stitched from an old flour sack. The sun hung low behind a veil of haze, and the air carried a stillness that meant the harvest moon wasn't far off. Cass had been gone since morning, riding out toward the low ridge where a neighbor's cattle had gone missing. He'd offered to help track in exchange for seed they could plant next spring, barley, maybe millet if the soil allowed. Everett watched the trail for his return, her hand resting gently on the bundle of warmth against her ribs. Inside the cabin, the kettle hissed. She'd boiled stinging nettle for her hands, which ached after setting stones along the garden bed. She hadn't mentioned the pain to Cass. He already spent too much time watching her, like she might slip away if he blinked. When hoofbeats sounded near dusk, Everett stepped off the porch and waited. Cass rode in slow, leading a sorrel with a lame foreleg. "Tripped in a sinkhole," he said as he dismounted. "Couldn't leave her out there." Everett stepped forward, careful not to wake Bishop. "She yours now," Cass touched the filly's shoulder. "Only if she pulls through." He led the horse toward the shed, and Everett followed, watching the way he moved, deliberate, quiet, like he didn't want to disturb the evening itself. Inside the shed, he wrapped the leg with strips torn from an old saddlebag, binding it smooth. "You ever thought about keeping more stock?" she asked softly. "Not much point, just the three of us." Everett didn't reply right away. Then, "What if there were 4? Cass's hands stilled. He turned toward her, eyes narrowing just enough to show he'd heard her right. She glanced down at Bishop, whose lashes fluttered in sleep beneath the sling. "It's early yet," she said, "but I can feel it." Cass stepped closer, not touching her, just standing near enough that she felt the warmth off his skin. "You sure?" She nodded once. "Same pull in the belly. Same tired in the bones." He exhaled through his nose and looked at her for a long moment, then down at Bishop. His voice, when it came, was low. "You afraid?" "A little." He reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her temple. "You weren't last time." "I was. I just didn't say it." "I'll build you another cradle," he said. Everett leaned into him then, and he wrapped one arm around her back, the other hand resting on Bishop's sling. "We've got time," he murmured. "And more hands now." That night she stirred the fire while Cass sanded the handle of a scythe he'd found rusted behind the smokehouse. The blade gleamed now, sharpened and oiled, ready for fall cutting. "I used to think life was something you had to chase down," she said, not looking up. "Outrun the bad parts, find the good parts before they vanished." Cass set the scythe aside, wiping his hands on his trousers. "And now," she met his eyes. "Now I think it's something you build, slow, with your hands and your heart." He didn't reply, just crossed the room and knelt beside her. When he kissed her, it wasn't out of hunger or heat, it was something rooted, like the first furrow cut into untouched earth. She leaned into it, holding his face, her fingers rough and warm. Later, as Bishop slept in the cradle Cass had made weeks ago, they lay on the bed they'd built from cedar planks and wool batting, the windows open to the sound of crickets and owls beyond the trees. Everett traced the line of Cass's shoulder, her voice barely above breath. "You think this place will hold us?" He turned his head so their foreheads touched. "It already does." In the morning, they rose with the sun. Everett fed Bishop while Cass hauled water. They worked without words for a while, the way people do when nothing's broken. Come midday, Everett sat with her feet in the stream that ran behind the shed, Bishop beside her on a blanket of canvas and cotton. She hummed tunelessly, watching the breeze ripple the surface. Cass joined her with a tin plate of wild berries he'd picked near the bluff. "Neighbor came by," he said, handing her the plate. "Said he's got a plow he'll lend us if we're thinking of planting." Everett chewed a berry, tart and red. "We'll need a second pair of hands come spring." "I'll ask around," he said. "Might be a boy looking for work." She looked up at him. "We're starting something, aren't we?" Cass didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "We already have." They didn't talk of leaving anymore. The prairie had stopped being something they crossed. Now it was something they belonged to. And as the days shortened and the geese began to fly low overhead, Everett kept one hand resting over the new life growing within her, and the other always found Cass's when the sky turned dark. They were more than safe now. They were rooted. By the time frost laced the nettle beds, and the first geese had long since passed overhead, Everett began rising slower, her center of gravity shifting with the weight of the new child growing inside her. The mornings came quiet, Bishop now crawling and pulling himself up against the hearthstones, his hands always reaching for whatever caught the light. Cass had started building a smokehouse beside the shed, hauling stone from the creek and splitting cedar to line the inside. He worked with deliberate care, his back to the wind, hands steady even as the air grew colder each day. Everett watched him once through the cabin window. Bishop balanced on her hip and said, "You never talk about what you want." Cass didn't answer right away. He laid another stone, then stood, brushing grit from his palms. "What if I already have it?" he said, turning toward her. She stepped outside, Bishop nestled beneath a shawl she'd sewn from old muslin and wool scraps. "That ain't what I mean." Cass wiped his brow with his sleeve, then leaned against the frame of the smokehouse door. "What do you mean then? You've built all this with me, but it's always like you're waiting on something to go wrong." His jaw flexed slightly. "That's not about you." "I know it's not," she said, "but we're here now, and I think you might be the only one who doesn't believe it's real." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes dark under the shadow of the eave. "I don't know how to live like things last." Everett stepped closer until her boot tips touched his. "Then learn here, with us." Cass didn't speak, but he reached down and ran a thumb along Bishop's cheek, the boy squinting up at him with a half-toothed grin. Later that week, a traveling tinker passed through with a wagon full of tin goods and cast-offs. Cass traded a cured hide for a second kettle and a pair of knitting needles. Everett held them in her hands that night, turning them over by the fire. "I haven't done this since I was a girl," she murmured, testing the balance of them. Cass glanced up from where he was whittling a spoon. "What you make back then?" "Socks mostly. My mother said a woman ought to keep her family's feet warm before anything else." "You miss her?" he asked. Everett let the firelight flicker against her face before answering. When I'm quiet long enough, I can still hear her singing while she stitched. I try to hum the same tune when I rock Bishop." Cass nodded, then leaned forward. "What was she like?" She worked hard, talked soft, and never once let the weather decide her day. Cass looked at her hands. "I see some of that in you," she shook her head. "Maybe before, I'm still trying to find it again." "You will." They didn't speak for a stretch after that. The fire snapped and Bishop shifted in his sleep. When Everett finally looked up again, Cass had set the spoon aside and was watching her, not expectant, just present. "I like that you don't fill silence just to fill it," she said. "I like that you notice." The first snow came earlier than expected, tracing the edges of the windows and blanketing the grass in white hush. Everett dragged a quilt outside and laid it across the woodpile, brushing snow off with her sleeve. Cass emerged from the shed with a sack of kindling, his breath rising in slow clouds. "You're not supposed to be lifting," he said, nudging the quilt from her arm. "I'm not lifting," she said, brushing her hands off. "I'm straightening." He raised an eyebrow. "That what we're calling it now?" She gave a quick glance toward the cabin. "Bishop's down. I don't like sitting too long." Cass set the kindling down, then turned to her. "You ever think about naming this place?" She blinked. "The land, the home. Feels like it deserves a name." She looked out past the split rail fence where snow clung to the branches and the sky hung low and pale. "Maybe something simple," she said. "Something that don't sound like it's trying too hard." He stood beside her, quiet. "Then what about Stillwater?" She turned to him. "Why that?" He shrugged. "It's what it feels like the part of the river where things finally stop rushing." Everett smiled, slow and soft. "Stillwater," she said again, testing it. "Yeah. That sounds right." Cass reached for her hand, his fingers rough and cold but sure. "Then let's keep building it." They stood together as the snow thickened, the world around them muffled and close. Inside, the hearth burned low and Bishop stirred in his sleep. Everett leaned against Cass's side, her breath steady, one hand resting where new life stirred beneath her ribs. They didn't speak again that evening. They didn't need to. The days ahead would be hard in new ways, chopping wood through frozen ground, keeping a fire through long nights, coaxing milk from the goat Cass planned to barter for once the roads cleared, but none of it felt uncertain anymore. Not with roots sunk deep, not with hands held firm, not with Stillwater beneath their feet. By early March, the ground had begun to thaw in streaks along the southern slope behind the cabin. The air still carried a bite, but the light had changed longer now, reaching deeper into the trees each afternoon. Cass stood at the edge of the garden plot, turning soil with a spade he'd sharpened that morning. His coat hung on the fence post, his sleeves rolled above his forearms, revealing a long white scar that Everett hadn't noticed before. She came out with a jar of pickled turnips and a strip of linen wrapped around her wrist. Bishop toddled behind her, wobbling over the ruts of earth, his fingers outstretched toward the half-dug furrows. Everett handed Cass the jar. "You never told me how you got that," she said, nodding toward his arm. Cass took the jar and set it gently on the ground. "Caught it on barbed wire outside Dodge when I was 17. Tried to clear a fence in the dark. Thought I could outrun a man who'd caught me taking jerky from his smokehouse." She raised her brows. "You stole jerky." He didn't look at her. "I hadn't eaten in 3 days." She knelt and began pulling thin winter roots from the edge of the plot, fingers careful despite the dull ache in her joints. "You ever think about going back to Dodge?" "Not once," he said. "There's nothing for me west of Abilene." He paused, pushing the spade into the dirt, then said, "You want to name the next one?" Everett looked up. "You want to?" "I do," he said. "If it's a girl." She stood slowly, brushing her skirt. "Then you'd best start thinking." Cass nodded once. "I will, something that sounds like spring." That night, Everett sat beside the fire with her feet propped on a stool Cass had carved from a fallen elm. Her belly had grown firm and high, the child inside shifting in slow, steady turns. Bishop lay curled in a woven basket beneath the window, one hand tucked under his cheek. Cass brought over a folded cotton bundle and set it beside her. Inside were 5 small shirts of unbleached muslin, all stitched by hand. "I traded for these in town," he said. The shopkeeper's wife had a stack she was saving for her sister, but I told her we'd lost most of what we had in the flood that came through last summer. Everett looked at him. There wasn't a flood. He sat down across from her. She didn't ask for details. She unfolded one of the shirts, running her thumb over the seams. You didn't have to. I wanted to. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I want to give them more than I had. She met his eyes. You already have. Cass reached for her hand and she let him take it, her fingers resting in his. I've been thinking, he said. Once the snow melts for good, I could raise a lean-to behind the cabin, maybe keep chickens, sell eggs in town, Everett considered. You think there's enough demand? Doc and Selena said he'd buy fresh every week. He's got a new wife, expects a child this summer, said he wants to feed her right. She nodded. Then we'll need a henhouse. I'll build one. When Everett went into labor, it was past midnight. The wind had settled and the moon was low behind a bank of cloud. She didn't cry out, only gripped the bed frame and whispered Cass's name. He rose instantly, gathering the kettle for boiling water, then helped her down onto the pallet they'd prepared. Bishop slept through it all, curled beneath a quilt Everett's mother had sewn before her passing. Cass knelt beside her, wiping her brow with a cloth. You're not alone, he said. I know, she breathed. This time the labor moved quick. Her body remembered what it needed to do, and by dawn, the child was born a girl with a head of dark hair and lungs strong enough to rattle the shutters. Cass wrapped her in the softest muslin shirt and laid her on Everett's chest. She's here, he whispered. Everett wept, not from pain but from something heavier and lighter all at once. Cass pressed a kiss to her temple and stayed there, his hand on her hair, the other resting on the child's back. They named her Wren. In the weeks that followed, Stillwater grew into itself. Cass built the henhouse with cedar and scrap iron, and Everett painted the door with lye wash, adding a carved wooden bird above the latch. Bishop learned to say egg before he could say yes, and Wren slept with one hand always curled around the hem of her mother's shawl. One evening, with the sky turning gold, Everett stood behind the cabin, watching Cass string wire along the last of the fence posts. Bishop toddled after a grasshopper, and Wren dozed in a sling across Everett's chest. Cass, Everett called. He looked up, resting one arm on the post. She stepped forward, stopping just short of him. You ever think we'd end up here? He looked out at the land, the lines they'd carved from it with sweat and care. Then he met her eyes. I didn't know where I'd end up, he said. But I hoped it might be with someone who saw me like you do. She touched his cheek, her thumb brushing the stubble along his jaw. I see you, she said, and I love you. He pulled her in gently, careful not to jostle Wren, and kissed her slow. The kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything, only offered. They stood like that until the wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet grass and cedar. Bishop ran between them with a handful of dandelions, and Cass scooped him up, tossing him easily onto his shoulder. Everett laughed and Wren stirred, blinking up at the light. The four of them walked back to the cabin, the door left open to the breeze, the fire already lit inside. Cass set Bishop down and waited as Everett stepped through the threshold. Then he followed, closing the door behind them not to keep the world out but to keep the warmth in, and together, in the house they'd built with their own hands on land that knew their names, they lived. Not in memory of what they'd lost, but in full measure of what they'd made. A life that held steady and true season after season. A home, a family, a love that stayed.